A moment of resilience. Sergeant Marcus Hayes stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace, a figure of unwavering discipline amidst the chaotic bustle of tourists and the heat of the summer day. His dark uniform, adorned with gold buttons, felt heavier than usual under the sweltering sun, but he made no effort to adjust it. The red tunic and the tall black bearskin hat he wore were the symbols of his dedication to a long-standing tradition, a tradition he had upheld for 6 years as one of the few black royal guards in the history of Buckingham Palace. The changing of the guard ceremony was underway, a momentous event that attracted throngs of visitors from all corners of the world. Families, couples, and curious tourists, with cameras in hand, lined the gates to capture the iconic event. Marcus had become used to the spectacle, the rhythm of the ceremony, the march of his fellow guards, the steady beats of the regimental band, and the symphony of awestruck whispers around him. He knew his role in this pageantry. He was not just a soldier. He was a living emblem of Britain's tradition, a protector of history and heritage, and an embodiment of discipline and dignity. Despite his stoic exterior, Marcus couldn't help but feel the heaviness of the day. The weight of the uniform, the relentless sun beating down on him, and the suffocating sense of heat in the crowded street. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but Marcus stood tall, his back straight, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His training had prepared him for moments like this, moments when fatigue, discomfort, and the subtle mocking of the crowd tested his resolve. It was in these moments that Marcus reflected on the years of training he had endured. The grueling drills, the endless hours of perfecting his posture, and the mental fortitude required to withstand the constant scrutiny of the public. His mind occasionally drifted back to the day he first put on the royal uniform. The pride he felt, knowing that he had earned his place in this hallowed institution, despite the challenges he had faced as one of the few black men ever to serve as a royal guard. The crowd around him grew louder, their excited chatter blending with the music of the band. The tourists, eager to witness the historic ceremony, seemed to treat it as little more than an amusement, a brief spectacle to tick off on their list of things to see in London. But Marcus remained unfazed. He had seen it all before. The laughter, the questions, the curiosity. These were things he had long since learned to ignore. After all, it was his job to be nothing more than a silent sentinel, unmoving and undistracted. However, as the ceremony progressed, a sudden shift in the atmosphere caught Marcus's attention. A voice, sharp and cutting, broke through the noise of the crowd. "Hey, Black One, why don't you smile for the camera?" The voice, dripping with disdain, cut through the air like a knife. Marcus stiffened. The taunt wasn't new. He had faced his share of racial comments during his years of service. Tourists, oblivious to the significance of the royal guard, often took the opportunity to mock or try to provoke a reaction from him. But this felt different. The woman's voice was laced with malice, her words deliberately designed to demean and belittle him. Marcus fought the urge to respond. His training kicked in, his face remaining impassive, his posture unyielding. His eyes remained fixed ahead, not allowing the woman's words to break his focus. It was a delicate dance he had mastered over the years, bearing the weight of the world's prejudices on his shoulders while remaining a pillar of unwavering dignity. The woman, seeing his lack of reaction, grew bolder. Her voice became louder, more venomous. "Look at this. This isn't the Britain I know. They should be wearing real British uniforms, not these ridiculous things." Her words echoed through the crowd, the laughter from a few nearby tourists only intensifying the sting of her comments. Marcus could feel his blood begin to boil, but he remained motionless, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He had heard these kinds of comments countless times before, and every time he had chosen to stay silent. It was the only way he knew how to survive the daily barrage of insults and mockery. But deep inside, a fire was beginning to ignite. The words she spoke were not just about the uniform or the job he performed. They were a challenge to his very identity, his place in this country, and his right to exist as a black man in a system that had long favored others. The woman, emboldened by Marcus's silence, continued her taunts, her voice growing louder, filled with a mix of anger and ridicule. Is this what Britain has become? A land of diversity, but not a single real British person to be found. What a joke. Around her, the crowd's laughter echoed like a chorus of approval. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered among themselves, but all were complicit in the spectacle that was unfolding before them. Marcus's mind raced. The heat from the sun now felt unbearable, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The sweat ran down his face, mixing with the anger and frustration building inside him. He could feel his hands tightening around the rifle, the bayonet glinting in the sunlight. His mind flashed back to all the moments he had fought to keep his composure, his training, the lessons his mentors had drilled into him, the understanding that he had to rise above. But today, something inside him snapped. The woman's next words hit like a slap to the face. Look at you, standing there like a statue. Probably don't even understand what I'm saying, do you? Don't even know what real Britain is. Something inside Marcus boiled over. The insults, the mockery, the dismissal of his very humanity, all of it combined into a single moment. He had spent 6 years holding back, enduring the taunts and slights, but this was too much. This was where the line was drawn. Without thinking, Marcus shifted his stance, his body moving with a speed and force that was unimaginable to the crowd. The woman, caught off guard by his sudden movement, was left with no time to react as Marcus's hand shot out, his palm connecting sharply with her cheek. The crowd went silent. The air was thick with shock. The woman's hand flew to her face, her mouth hanging open in disbelief as she stumbled back. Marcus's breathing was heavy, his heart racing. He hadn't meant to do it. He hadn't meant to break his discipline, to throw away years of training. But in that moment, the weight of his anger, the crushing weight of racism and disrespect, had simply become too much to bear. The woman's face turned red, not with embarrassment, but with rage. She opened her mouth to shout, but before she could utter a word, a police officer stationed nearby rushed over, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the officer asked, his gaze flicking between Marcus and the woman. "That man slapped me," the woman shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. The officer's eyes narrowed as he turned to Marcus, his voice steady but firm. "Sergeant, what's going on here?" Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. He knew he had just broken the code that had governed his every action for years, but there was no turning back now. The aftermath of a moment. The air around Marcus hung thick with tension, the stares of onlookers weighing heavily on him as the crowd fell into a stunned silence. The woman's cry still echoed in his ears, but he felt strangely detached from it, as though it belonged to a different version of himself. Someone who hadn't spent 6 years standing at attention, a human statue to be judged, mocked, and ridiculed. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't move, his posture still rigid and straight despite the chaos brewing around him. The police officer's voice, calm but authoritative, pierced through the fog of his mind. "Sergeant, what's going on here?" The question, though simple, felt like the weight of an entire lifetime of moments he had endured. Marcus's heart beat faster, but his external composure held steady. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking with the officer's. The silence stretched on, the seconds feeling like hours. His lips parted, but no words came. What could he say? How could he explain what had just happened? How could he justify it? He had always been the model of restraint. For years, he had stood guard, unflinching in the face of jeers, insults, and even violent provocation. But today, something had snapped. Something deep inside him, a well of unspoken frustration, had broken free. He had crossed a line. And now, the consequences were unfolding before him. The woman was still holding her cheek, her face a mixture of shock and fury. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open in indignation, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. The officer's gaze shifted from her to Marcus, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sergeant, I need you to explain yourself. What happened here?" Marcus took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. His eyes flicked over to the woman, who was now muttering angrily, her voice rising in pitch as she turned to the crowd. "He slapped me. A royal guard actually slapped me. Do you see this? This is an outrage." The crowd, once silent, was now murmuring in disbelief. Some appeared shocked, while others seemed unsure of how to respond. They had come to witness a spectacle, to see the perfect precision of the changing of the guard ceremony. Not this. Not violence. The tourists, many of whom had never seen the darker side of this country's history, looked around, unsure how to react. The tension in the air was palpable. The invisible divide between privilege and prejudice laid bare for all to witness. The officer took a step forward, his hand resting on the radio at his side, as if ready to call for backup if things escalated further. "Sergeant, I'm going to need you to step aside." Marcus didn't move. His boots were planted firmly on the ground, the polished leather reflecting the sunlight. For a brief moment, he considered what it would mean to move, to step away. But something inside him, something that had been buried deep for far too long, kept him rooted to the spot. The woman's voice broke through his thoughts again, now trembling with outrage. "I demand an apology. This is unacceptable," she shouted, her finger jabbing in his direction. "I'm not going to apologize." Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but steady, laced with an intensity that caught even him by surprise. "What happened here today? It's not just about what you did to me. It's about everything. The years of insults, the disregard, the mocking. It all culminated in this moment." His word hung in the air like a thunderclap. The officer blinked, momentarily taken aback by Marcus's response. The crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from one figure to the next, unsure whether to be sympathetic or judgmental. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Are you seriously trying to justify this? You've gone mad." Her face was flushed with anger, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone, now turned towards the officer, recording everything. But Marcus wasn't finished. He wasn't going to shrink back into silence. "You came here today to mock me," he said, his voice growing louder, carrying through the air. "You didn't see a soldier. You didn't see someone who has given everything for this role. All you saw was a target, a way to provoke, to diminish, to belittle." The officer raised his hand slightly, a gesture of calm, but also of caution. "Sergeant, this isn't the way we handle things here. You know better than this." Marcus didn't flinch. He couldn't. The heat that radiated from the pavement seemed to mirror the fire in his chest. For 6 years, he had endured the silent slights, the covert racism, the quiet whispers behind his back. For 6 years, he had stood tall in a uniform that had always seemed to say more about his race than his dedication. He had been proud of his position. But today, it felt hollow. Today, the weight of history had crushed the last bit of patience he had left. "I know exactly what I've done," Marcus said, his gaze never wavering from the woman. "But it's about time someone stood up to this. It's time for things to change." The officer's hand lowered, and for a moment, there was a lull in the chaos. The woman, realizing she was not going to receive the apology she sought, huffed and turned away, her hands flying in exaggerated frustration. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice carrying as she stormed off toward the exit of the crowd. "You'll be sorry for this. This is a disgrace." As the woman disappeared into the distance, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some were shocked, others were nodding in agreement with Marcus's words, and a few were still shaking their heads, unsure how to process the incident. But all of them had witnessed something that couldn't be undone. The power dynamics had shifted, even if just for a brief moment. The officer turned back to Marcus, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant, I'll need you to come with me. We'll sort this out privately." Marcus didn't move immediately. Instead, He looked around at the crowd one more time. He could feel the eyes of the tourists, the weight of their gaze, as if they were silently asking him to apologize for breaking the tradition they had come to see. But Marcus knew that the real tradition, the one that truly mattered, was the dignity of every individual, the right to be respected and valued, no matter their race or background. "I'll follow you," Marcus said finally, his voice calm but resolute. As he took one last look at the palace behind him, he realized that today was not just a moment of rebellion, it was a beginning. A new chapter, where silence was no longer an option, and where he could no longer pretend that the history he had inherited, one steeped in colonialism and prejudice, wasn't still affecting the present. Today, he had chosen to speak out, to act, and to show the world that he would not be silent any longer. The officer walked ahead of him, and Marcus followed, each step echoing through the quiet courtyard. The consequences of his actions had just begun to unfold, and no one could yet know how far those ripples would travel. Breaking the silence, the stone corridors of Buckingham Palace were eerily quiet as Marcus followed the officer down a long hallway, the echo of their boots against the marble floor the only sound breaking the stillness. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though each stride carried with it a weight he hadn't anticipated when he first entered the guard service 6 years ago. The room they were heading toward, one that would inevitably become the site of his reckoning, was just ahead. It wasn't just a disciplinary meeting. It was something deeper, something that would affect everything he had worked for in this institution. As they reached the small, nondescript office, the officer, whose name Marcus still hadn't caught, stopped in front of the door. His expression was tense, but there was a flicker of understanding behind his eyes. "Stay here," he said, his tone flat, before entering the office to speak with someone inside. Marcus stood in the corridor, alone but not alone. The silence felt suffocating. He leaned back against the cool wall, his mind racing. The weight of his actions began to set in, and with it, the flood of uncertainty that had been building all day. What would happen now? He had acted in the heat of the moment, but the consequences of that moment were more than just a slap to a woman's face. They were a direct challenge to the foundations of the Royal Guard, the very institution that had become his life for so many years. He had broken a sacred rule, discipline above all else, and there would be no going back. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself, but images of that woman's face kept flashing in his mind. The words she had thrown at him, her scorn, the laughter that had followed, reverberated through his mind like a bad echo. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It wasn't just about his frustration boiling over. It was about a system that for so long had demanded compliance while undermining his humanity. The realization was slowly dawning on him. This wasn't just a one-off incident. This was a reflection of something much deeper. A societal issue that went beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, beyond the ceremonial guard, beyond his service. In that moment, Marcus understood that the sacrifice he had made by stepping out of line was not just for himself. It wasn't just for his dignity. He had, in some small way, taken a stand for all those who had been overlooked, undermined, and silenced for too long. His pride in his role as a royal guard had been shattered in a moment, but his sense of self, of what he truly stood for, had only grown stronger. The door opened abruptly, and the officer emerged, motioning for Marcus to follow him into the office. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Marcus stepped inside, greeted by the stern faces of 2 senior officers seated behind a polished wooden desk. The man who spoke first was the commanding officer of the guard, a man Marcus had seen many times, but never really spoken to, until now. "Sergeant Hayes," the officer began, his voice stern but not unkind, "you've broken a fundamental rule of this institution today. We have a strict code of conduct in the Royal Guard, one that you know well. Silence, discipline, and restraint are our guiding principles. Your actions today have called that into question." Marcus stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back. The words stung, but he didn't flinch. He had spent too long holding his emotions back. Now was not the time to lose his composure. He stood still, a man facing the consequences of his own rebellion. "I understand," he said simply. "But I also have to tell you that what happened today wasn't just about me losing my temper. It wasn't just about breaking a rule. It was about everything that's been building up. Every insult, every glance, every little microaggression I've faced for years. You see, there's a breaking point for everyone. And today, I reached mine." The room was silent for a beat, the senior officers exchanging glances as they processed his words. Marcus didn't care if they judged him. He had spoken his truth. "I'm not just a soldier in this uniform. I'm a black man, and I've been reminded of that every single day. Today, I made a choice. I decided I would no longer stand silently while my dignity is questioned." The commanding officer sighed, leaning back in his chair. "This is a delicate matter, Sergeant. The Royal Guard is the epitome of discipline and respect, both for the Crown and for the public. What you've done today, while understandable on a human level, threatens the very image of the monarchy. You must realize the gravity of that." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I do. But I can't stand here anymore and pretend that things are fine, that nothing has changed. The world is changing, and it's about time the Guard changes with it. We have to be a symbol of respect for all Britons, not just the ones who fit a certain mold." A silence fell over the room as the officers processed his words. The commanding officer looked at the officer who had been with Marcus outside. The man nodded slightly, as if in silent agreement. Finally, the commanding officer spoke again, his tone still measured but with an air of understanding. "Sergeant Hayes, I don't disagree with you. There is an undeniable shift happening in this country, and the monarchy is not immune to it. However, the decision you made today, though it came from a place of pain, has repercussions. You cannot simply walk away from this situation without facing the consequences." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had known this moment would come. He had known that standing up for his dignity, for his rights, would come with a price. But he had also known that it was a price worth paying. "I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come from this," he said. "I've spent too long pretending it didn't matter. I've spent too long pretending that I didn't matter." The commanding officer leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Then we will make our decision. We need time to consider everything you've said today. But know this, Sergeant, the Guard has always been a symbol of loyalty to the Crown. And right now, you've tested that loyalty in ways that will require a great deal of thought." Marcus nodded, his gaze never wavering. "I've always been loyal. But loyalty can't be blind." The officers exchanged another look before the commanding officer stood up. "For now, you'll return to your quarters and await our final decision. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss the next steps." Marcus turned on his heel, walking toward the door. As he stepped out into the corridor, the weight of his words still echoed in his mind. He had stood up today, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt small, invisible, or unheard. He had taken a stand for a better future, one where he didn't have to shrink into the background, where his identity wasn't a threat or a point of ridicule. As he walked down the long hallway toward his quarters, he couldn't help but wonder, would the monarchy ever change? Would this institution, steeped in centuries of tradition, ever embrace the diversity it claimed to represent? Or would his actions today be the final spark in a struggle that had no end in sight? The answers to those questions were still unclear, but one thing was certain: Marcus Hayes would never be silent again. Consequences and conviction. The days following the incident felt like an eternity. Each moment seemed suspended in time, the uncertainty hanging over Marcus like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. He had been ordered back to his quarters after the meeting with the senior officers, his uniform still crisp, but his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He was alone now, in the room he had called his own for the past 6 years, the small but neat space that had once symbolized the pride he felt in serving the Crown. The walls, adorned with photos of past ceremonies and achievements, now felt cold, distant, like reminders of a life that had, in many ways, been taken for granted. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, his head resting in his hands. The events of the past few days played over and over in his mind, each thought more chaotic than the last. He could still hear the woman's voice, the venom in her words, the shock on her face when he'd broken his silence. But it wasn't just her. It was the anger he had felt boiling inside of him, the years of suppression, the weight of 1,000 small slights that had finally caused him to snap. And now, there was no undoing it. The decision was still pending, the Royal Guard's leadership still deliberating over what action to take. Would they expel him? Would they demote him? Would they make an example of him? A warning to anyone who might dare to break the code of conduct. Marcus couldn't help but wonder if they would. He had, after all, stepped out of line in a way that no one in his position ever had before. But as much as he feared the outcome, part of him also knew that he had made the right choice, even if it had come with consequences. The knock on his door startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He stood quickly, smoothing his uniform out of reflex before answering. It was the same officer who had been with him during the confrontation, a man named Lieutenant David Miller. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture, as though he were unsure of what to say. "Sergeant," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice low but firm. "The commanding officer has requested your presence again." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time the commanding officer had summoned him, but this time felt different. The weight of the meeting that was to come pressed down on him. He nodded silently and followed the lieutenant down the long hallways of Buckingham Palace, each step feeling heavier than the last. The room they entered was small, but the atmosphere was thick with the presence of authority. The commanding officer and the other senior officers were seated at the table, their expressions serious and unreadable. Marcus stood before them, his back straight, his shoulders squared, despite the storm brewing inside him. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing: he was ready to face it. "Sergeant Hayes," the commanding officer began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that reflected the gravity of the situation. "We've deliberated on your actions, and it's clear that what happened on the grounds that day was not just an isolated incident. It was the result of years of systemic frustration, personal anguish, and the tension that has built up over time." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. The words were not unexpected, but hearing them aloud felt like a confirmation of everything he had come to realize in the past few days. He wasn't just being judged for his actions on that day. He was being judged for a lifetime of being overlooked, underestimated, and silenced. "You've broken the Royal Guard's code of conduct," the commanding officer continued, "and we cannot overlook that. The Royal Guard must remain a symbol of unwavering discipline, a representation of the monarchy's strength and tradition. Any deviation from that tradition, no matter the reason, threatens to undermine the very foundation we stand on." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard the criticisms before, had lived with them for years. The Guard was more than just a job. It was a symbol, a tradition that carried centuries of history. And yet today, he felt as though he was being asked to choose between his identity and his duty. "But," the commanding officer continued, "we have also listened to your side of the story. We've considered your words and the context of the situation. This institution, as respected as it is not immune to change. And we recognize that. It is because of this that we have decided, after much deliberation, that we are not removing you from your post." The room was silent, the tension almost palpable. Marcus's heart raced as he processed the words. He had prepared himself for the worst, but hearing that he would not be dismissed was a shock. It was as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders, but a new kind of weight began to settle in its place. What did this mean for him now? However, the commanding officer continued, "Your actions must still have consequences. You will be placed on a probationary period for the next 6 months. During that time, You will be expected to undergo additional training, both in terms of discipline and cultural sensitivity, and you will not be permitted to serve in any public-facing duties. You will be restricted to non-visible positions until the end of your probation. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He had known that some form of punishment was inevitable, but the probation felt like a long, drawn-out punishment, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for breaking the silence. But even as he processed the restrictions, part of him felt relieved. He wasn't being cast aside. He wasn't being erased from this institution that had come to mean so much to him. "Do you understand the terms of your probation, Sergeant Hayes?" the commanding officer asked, his tone not unkind but still firm. "I do, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Good. We will expect you to fully comply with the terms set before you. If you fail to meet the expectations, then further disciplinary action will be taken, and the consequences will be much more severe." "Understood, sir." The meeting was over as quickly as it had begun, and Marcus was dismissed. As he stepped out of the room, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He wasn't being kicked out of the Royal Guard, but the road ahead was going to be more complicated than ever before. The probation felt like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a reprieve, a chance to prove himself and continue his service to the Crown. On the other hand, it was a reminder of his moment of defiance, a constant mark against his name. Walking down the corridor toward his quarters, Marcus couldn't help but think about the broader implications of the decision. He had stepped out of line, broken the unspoken rules of the Guard, but in doing so, he had forced a conversation to happen, one that had been long overdue. It wasn't just about the Royal Guard anymore. It was about a society that needed to confront its own demons, its own prejudices. And while the consequences were still fresh, Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. His probation wouldn't just be about proving himself to the commanding officer. It would be about proving to himself that standing up for what was right, even when it cost him, was worth every challenge ahead. As he walked through the palace halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that his fight, his journey, was far from over. But for the first time, he felt as though he had the power to change it. The future was uncertain, but it was his future to shape. And that, in itself, was a victory. The struggle within. The weeks following Marcus's probation were nothing short of a personal battle. Each day felt like an uphill struggle, as if he were constantly climbing a mountain, with the weight of his past actions hanging over him like a shadow. The initial shock of the commanding officer's decision had given way to a deep and persistent unease. Marcus wasn't just facing a temporary punishment. He was confronting his own sense of identity and his place within an institution that had, until now, defined much of who he was. His probationary period began with a series of intense training sessions designed not only to reinforce the traditional values of the Royal Guard, but also to address issues of cultural sensitivity, diversity, and a kind of emotional restraint that had long been expected of him. It felt like a constant reminder of everything he had fought against in that fateful moment. The Guard was a place where silence and obedience were revered, where questioning the status quo was almost unthinkable. But now Marcus couldn't help but question everything. Each day he donned the uniform, he found it harder to ignore the underlying tension in the air. The senior officers, though polite, treated him with a thinly veiled distance. They were respectful, but there was a sense that they didn't truly understand what he had gone through, or what had driven him to his breaking point. The cultural sensitivity courses, though well-meaning, felt like they were only scraping the surface of a much deeper issue. The Guard was still, in many ways, an institution built on tradition, on maintaining a semblance of unity through unquestioned discipline and homogeneity. Marcus had long known that diversity within the ranks was limited, but now it felt like a glaring contradiction. How could he uphold a tradition of silence and submission in an institution that couldn't even fully embrace the diversity of its own people? How could he continue to stand for a monarchy that, though a symbol of unity and tradition, was still struggling to accept all the faces that made up the fabric of modern Britain? In the first few weeks of his probation, Marcus's days were filled with long hours of solitary work, duties that kept him away from the public eye, and consequently, away from the scrutiny of tourists. He cleaned and maintained the royal uniforms, spent hours polishing the rifles and bayonets, and carried out menial tasks around the palace. While the work was familiar, it felt like an insult to the years he had spent earning the right to stand at attention, to represent the crown with dignity. It felt like a demotion, even though it wasn't officially one. He wasn't just sidelined, he was rendered invisible. The palace, which once felt like a place of pride and purpose, now seemed like a labyrinth of walls and corridors where Marcus couldn't escape the suffocating weight of history. He had spent years standing still, both physically and emotionally, in a world that asked him to be nothing more than a silent, disciplined soldier. But now, in the quiet of his probation, the walls felt like they were closing in. His thoughts were constantly swirling, an unrelenting tide of doubt, anger, and frustration. The man he had been just a few weeks ago, the one who would never have questioned his duty, felt like a stranger to him now. There were moments when Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave his quarters in the mornings. He would stare at the uniform hanging neatly in his wardrobe, the red tunic and the bearskin hat that had once been a source of pride, now feeling like a shackle. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he had broken the guard's code, or the fact that he still felt like an outsider in a system that, deep down, would never fully embrace him. One evening, as the sun began to set and the palace grounds were bathed in a golden glow, Marcus found himself on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The stillness of the evening was almost therapeutic, the soft rustling of the trees and the distant hum of London's heartbeat offering a rare moment of peace. For a brief second, he closed his eyes, allowing himself to simply breathe. But the peace didn't last long. He could hear voices below, the tourists milling about, some laughing, some whispering, their voices carrying on the cool evening air. It was the same scene that had played out countless times over the years. Eager eyes trained on the palace gates, smartphones raised in a constant barrage of photos and videos. To them, he was just part of the show, a spectacle, a momentary curiosity. To them, he was still just a soldier in a red coat. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had become something else. He wasn't just a part of the tradition anymore. He was a symbol, one that had been changed, bent by the tension of a society that was slowly waking up to its own contradictions. His mind drifted back to that fateful day, the day when everything had come to a head. He remembered the woman's words, sharp and cruel. Look at him, standing there like a statue. He had been a statue, hadn't he? That's what the monarchy, the guard, had demanded of him. To remain stoic, unmoving, and unfeeling. To serve without question, without voice, without recognition. And yet, the moment he had snapped, when he had broken the silence, he had seen something. Something that had made him realize that he wasn't just a soldier in a uniform. He was a man, a human being, with a voice, a purpose, and a right to demand respect. It wasn't just the woman in the crowd. It wasn't just the slap, the insult, or the taunts. It was everything. The years of silence, the years of feeling like he didn't belong, the years of fighting to prove himself, only to be ignored or dismissed. The guard had been his life, but it had also been his cage, and when he had finally broken free, even if only for a moment, he had felt like he was breathing for the first time. But now, in the stillness of his probation, that moment felt like a distant memory. The months ahead would test him, not just in terms of his place within the guard, but in terms of his own sense of self. Could he reconcile his duty with his dignity? Could he continue to serve the monarchy without losing his identity in the process? The questions haunted him daily. On one particularly long afternoon, Marcus found himself in the guard's training room, the rhythmic sound of his boots against the floor the only sound that accompanied him. The room was empty, save for a few of his fellow guards practicing their drills. They barely acknowledged him, and that was just fine. In many ways, he preferred it that way. As he walked past the rows of gleaming rifles, the bayonets reflecting the dim light from above, he stopped at the large mirror that hung on the far wall. He had never really paid attention to his reflection before. He had always focused on the uniform, the role he played, the job he was expected to do. But now, standing in front of the mirror, he saw something else. He saw a man who had been shaped by the weight of expectation, but also a man who was beginning to question that weight. He saw someone who had stood still for so long, but who was now learning to move. He didn't know what his future held. He didn't know if he would remain in the Royal Guard, or if he would leave it all behind. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the same man who had first put on that uniform all those years ago. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the Guard needed. A new beginning. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Marcus's quarters, casting long shadows on the floor. For the first time in weeks, the silence of the room felt less like a weight and more like a quiet invitation. He had spent the last month in a blur of reflection, self-doubt, and intense introspection. His probation period was nearing its end, and the looming decision about his future hung over him like a specter. As he dressed in the red tunic and bearskin hat once more, Marcus knew that today would mark the beginning of something. He just didn't know yet what that something would be. As he stood before the mirror, adjusting the insignia on his chest, he caught his reflection and paused. The man staring back at him was no longer the one who had quietly accepted the limitations of his role. This was someone different, someone who had walked through the fire of his own fears and frustrations and come out on the other side a little wiser, a little more grounded in his own truth. He still wore the uniform, the symbol of everything that he had once loved and loathed. But now, it wasn't just the external that defined him. It was the quiet revolution that had begun in his heart. The palace was quieter than usual as Marcus walked through the halls toward the courtyard. He could feel the weight of his probation still hanging over him, but today there was a new energy in his stride. His heart beat faster, not from the anxiety that had plagued him in the early days of his probation, but from the anticipation of what he was about to face. The decision he had fought for, the change he had hoped for, was finally within reach. As Marcus stepped into the courtyard, the air seemed to hum with the weight of tradition, of history, and of the present moment. It was the changing of the guard ceremony once again. But this time, things felt different. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, one that seemed to align with the subtle changes in Marcus himself. The tourists gathered outside the gates, their phones raised high, unaware of the quiet struggle unfolding behind the scenes. To them, this was just another spectacle to be enjoyed, another moment in the tapestry of their London visit. But Marcus knew better. For the first time since the incident, he stood tall at his post, his gaze unwavering. The weight of the uniform on his shoulders felt heavier than before, but this time it was a burden he was willing to bear. It wasn't just about being the perfect guard, the immovable symbol of tradition. No, today, it was about representing something greater, something he had come to understand during the long, difficult months of his probation. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who had a voice, a man who had fought to be seen, and more importantly, a man who had chosen to stand with pride. The crowds, oblivious to the inner transformation happening before them, continued to snap photos and whisper excitedly among themselves. As the ceremony began in earnest, Marcus locked eyes with a few of the onlookers, his presence more than just an image in the background. For the first time, he wasn't a silent statue. He was part of the scene, part of the living tradition. But now, his own life, his own story, was woven into it. The sound of the band playing filled the air, its familiar tunes now ringing with a sense of renewal, a sense of freedom. Marcus had been part of this routine for so long, but today he felt connected to it in a new way. As he stood, his rifle held steady, he wasn't just the embodiment of the monarchy's power or tradition. He was the embodiment of resilience, of the quiet courage that had led him to stand up for himself, for his own dignity, for the dignity of everyone who had ever been overlooked or silenced. The ceremony continued, the changing of the guards unfolding with the usual precision. But in Marcus's heart, the rhythm of the event had changed. It wasn't just about discipline or showing the world the perfection of the British Guard. It was about showing the world something deeper, the power of individual voices, the importance of questioning outdated traditions, and the undeniable truth that progress could only come when people dared to speak up. As the final moments of the ceremony approached, Marcus found himself standing alongside his fellow guards, all of them a part of the grand spectacle. The familiar faces, the years of camaraderie, felt different today. There was a subtle understanding between him and his fellow guards. They, too, had seen the shift in him. They had watched him struggle, grow, and finally find the courage to break free from the silence. In their eyes, he saw something he had never noticed before: respect. Not for the uniform he wore, but for the man he had become. The moment the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Marcus stayed behind for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the palace. There in the distance, he could see the familiar shapes of the senior officers walking toward him. His heart skipped a beat. This was the moment when everything would either stay the same or change forever. The commanding officer approached, his face serious but unreadable. Behind him, Lieutenant Miller stood, his expression a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Marcus stood at attention, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been through so much, had endured so many tests, and now it was time to face the final one. The officers stopped in front of him, and for a long moment, there was silence. "Sergeant Hayes," the commanding officer said, his voice steady, "we've observed your conduct over the last several weeks. You've demonstrated the discipline required of a Royal Guard, but more importantly, you've shown something that we rarely see in this institution. You've shown the courage to confront your own beliefs and to challenge those around you to do the same." Marcus's heart thudded loudly in his chest. He stood perfectly still, waiting for what would come next. "Because of this," the commanding officer continued, "we have decided that your probationary period is over. You are no longer restricted from public-facing duties, and your position within the Royal Guard remains intact." A rush of relief flooded Marcus. But it was more than just the lifting of restrictions. It was the recognition that, despite the pain and uncertainty, he had not only proven himself to the officers, but had also proven something far more significant: to himself. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of conviction. It wasn't just a simple gratitude. It was a recognition that this decision marked a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who would come after him. He had fought for his place, and now he could stand proudly in it. The commanding officer nodded, a rare glimmer of respect in his eyes. It's not often that the Guard is forced to question itself. But the truth is, we are stronger when we recognize our own flaws and work to fix them. Your actions have reminded us of that. As Marcus turned to walk back to his post, he could feel the weight of his uniform settling differently on his shoulders. It wasn't just a coat of red and gold anymore. It was a symbol of his journey, his struggle, and his commitment to being a part of something greater. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt truly ready to face whatever came next. The palace grounds seemed different now, as though they too were breathing with the quiet promise of change. And as Marcus stood tall once again, looking out at the crowd, he knew that this moment, this story, was far from over. It was only the beginning.